In 1988, a waitress living in Central Florida had just begun her shift at a local diner. While standing in the middle of the restaurant, she suddenly felt her heart start racing uncontrollably. She wasn't exerting herself in any way, so this sensation was startling and confusing. Unsure of what was happening, she quickly turned around and hurried to the bathroom, where she sat down in a stall, hoping the feeling would pass. However, the rapid heartbeat persisted, and soon after, she began to feel a tingling sensation in her feet and arms. At that moment, she feared she might be having a heart harm. But in reality, something far more sinister was occurring. Peggy Carr's life was never easy. Born in 1947 in a small rural town in Central Florida, her parents were deaf and had very little money. This meant Peggy had to start working from a young age. However, the jobs available to her were either low-paying or outright dangerous, such as overnight shifts at isolated truck stops where she waitressed alone. But Peggy never complained about her situation. She took whatever work she could find because she knew her family needed the money. When working in dangerous environments, she adopted a tough exterior to ward off potential threats. Despite her small stature, she quickly earned a reputation among her co-workers as someone you didn't want to mess with. Peggy didn't tolerate nonsense from anyone. However, this tough outer shell also made her seem unapproachable, which likely deterred potential romantic interests. Despite this, one man eventually broke through Peggy's defenses. They fell in love, got married, and had 3 children together. For a time, everything was perfect, until it wasn't. The marriage eventually fell apart, and by the mid-1980s, Peggy found herself a divorced mother of 3 teenage children, working overtime at a local diner just to make ends meet. While she maintained a tough and composed exterior at work, at home, her children saw a different side, a side marked by sadness. Peggy had worked hard to provide a stable and happy home for her kids, but she often felt like she had failed them. However, her children never resented her for the divorce. They only wished to see their mother happy again. They hoped that one day she would meet someone new and find happiness once more. In late 1987, their hopes came true when Peggy met Perry Ellen Carr, who went by the nickname Pie. Like Peggy, Pie was a recently divorced single parent, raising 2 teenage children of his own. He didn't take nonsense from anyone and had also started working from a young age. When Peggy met him, Pie was living in another small Central Florida town called Alturas, where he worked as the foreman at a phosphate mining company. Phosphate is a chemical used in various industrial and consumer products. Peggy and Pie began dating, and her children noticed a dramatic change in their mother. She was happier and more content than they had seen her in years. It seemed like Pie was her knight in shining armor. Just a few months later, in April 1988, Peggy and Pie got married, much to the excitement of their children. After the wedding, Peggy and her 3 children moved in with Pie and his 2 kids in his Alturas home. For a while, the newly blended family got along well, even though the house was small, and they were constantly around each other. It was chaotic, but lively. However, within a few months, Peggy and Pie began experiencing marital problems. The chemistry that had brought them together seemed to vanish, leaving only resentment in its place. To make matters worse, rumors began circulating in their small town that Pie was rekindling a relationship with an ex-girlfriend, leading to accusations of infidelity. Pie denied these allegations, but Peggy believed them, and their fights intensified. The conflicts created a rift between the 2 families, with Peggy's children siding with her and Pie's kids siding with him. To outsiders, it was clear that the marriage was on the brink of collapse. But before it could completely fall apart, something unexpected happened that would forever bind these 2 families. In late October 1988, about 7 months into their turbulent marriage, Pie abruptly told Peggy one morning that he was leaving for the day to go hunting. This was an unplanned trip, but neither of them wanted to spend time together, so Peggy didn't mind. She simply told him to enjoy his day and return later. After Pie left, Peggy and her daughter Sissy gathered their things, got into Peggy's car and drove into town. Both worked as waitresses at the same diner and had a shift that morning. They arrived, put on their uniforms and began working as usual. However, not long into the shift, Peggy noticed her heart was racing. She hadn't exerted herself, so the rapid heartbeat made no sense. Initially, she tried to ignore it, hoping it would pass. But when it didn't, she left her table and went to the staff bathroom, where she sat in a stall, hoping to calm down. But the racing heartbeat persisted, and she began feeling tingling in her legs and arms. Peggy, a no-nonsense person not prone to panic, began to suspect she might be having a heart harm. Deciding to take it seriously, she left the bathroom, washed her hands and face to calm herself, and went to the staff break room, where she told Sissy about her symptoms. Peggy assured her daughter that she would go home to rest and would go to the hospital if her condition worsened. Sissy, concerned, but knowing her mother's tough nature, agreed to let her go, but promised to check on her later. With her heart still racing and her limbs tingling, Peggy left the diner, got into her car, and drove home. When she arrived, the house was empty. She went inside and headed straight to her bedroom to lie down. After Peggy laid down in her bed to try to rest, her son Dwayne came home from high school that afternoon. When he walked inside, he found his mother lying in bed, which was very unusual. Dwayne couldn't remember a time when his mother took naps, not even when she was sick. Concerned, he went into her bedroom and found her facing away from him. He gently shook her awake, and when she turned to face him, her face was pale, she was sweating, and it was clear she hadn't been sleeping. Her teeth were clenched, and she seemed to be in significant pain or discomfort. "Mom, are you okay?" Dwayne asked, clearly worried. Peggy tried to reassure him, saying, "I'm fine, just trying to sleep something off. I think I might have the flu or something. I left work early, so I'm just resting." Dwayne knew his mother was tough and didn't usually complain about being sick. If she said she was going to sleep it off, she probably would. So, he told her, "Okay, but let me know if you need anything." As Dwayne started to walk away, Peggy called him back. She confessed that something was really wrong, telling him that it felt like fire was coursing through her veins in her arms and legs, causing unbearable pain. Hearing this, Dwayne knew it was serious. His mother wasn't one to exaggerate or complain unnecessarily. For her to describe such intense pain and to be bedridden because of it made him realize they needed to act. He urged her to go to the hospital, suggesting they either get Pi to drive her or call an ambulance. But despite the severe pain, Peggy was hesitant. She thought she could still sleep it off. At that moment, Pi returned from his hunting trip. Dwayne immediately ran to him, explaining how serious the situation was. He told Pi that his mom never acted like this and that they needed to take her to the hospital. Initially, Pi dismissed it, thinking she just had a fever or the flu and would sleep it off. But when he saw Peggy in such agony, he relented and agreed to take her to the hospital. Pi had to carry Peggy out of the house, put her in his truck, and drive her to the hospital. Upon arrival, he carried her into the hospital, where she was quickly put under the care of doctors. By that time, Peggy could no longer speak. She was in such excruciating pain that all she could do was moan. Her heart was still racing, and she was nauseous, vomiting, and spiraling rapidly. As the doctors began treating her, they turned to Pi, Dwayne, Sissy, and other family members to ask if they knew what could have caused this. None of them had any idea. They explained that Peggy had suddenly started feeling this way without any prior symptoms. The doctors, unable to ask Peggy due to her severe pain, began running a wide range of tests to try and figure out what was going on. However, all the results either came back negative or showed that everything was normal. Despite seeing Peggy's condition worsen, the doctors were at a loss. With no other options, they admitted her to a hospital room for monitoring. Surprisingly, after 3 days, Peggy's symptoms began to subside. While she wasn't back to full strength, she could speak, eat, drink, and move around, although still uncomfortable. Her heart would still race occasionally, and she experienced bouts of pain in her extremities. But overall, she seemed to be improving. After 3 days, she was discharged from the hospital. Peggy and her family returned home, initially thinking she was on the mend. However, within 24 hours, her symptoms returned. Her heart began racing again, and her arms and legs felt like they were on fire. Knowing the doctors hadn't been able to identify the condition, the family was deeply concerned. Despite their worry, returning to the hospital wasn't Peggy's first choice. She opted to stay home and wait it out, just as she had done at the hospital. Over the next few days, despite resting as much as possible, Peggy's condition worsened. She became completely bedridden, unable to move without severe pain. The situation became so dire that on October 30th, 10 days after her symptoms first appeared at the diner, the family decided enough was enough. They called an ambulance, which rushed Peggy back to the hospital. When she arrived, the doctors, remembering her from the week before, recognized the mystery surrounding her condition. They ran the same tests again, hoping to find some clue. But once again, the tests came back negative, inconclusive, or normal. Even tests for poisoning returned negative results, leaving the doctors completely stumped. With no clear answers, they once again admitted Peggy to a hospital room for monitoring. That night, the hospital wing was filled with the sound of Peggy's screams as she writhed in pain. The next morning, things took an even darker turn, not just for Peggy, who was now slipping in and out of consciousness, but also for her family. That morning, Dwayne and Pi's son Travis were both admitted to the same hospital with the same symptoms as Peggy. Their hearts were racing, they were nauseous and vomiting, and their arms and legs were tingling. The doctors, out of options, ran Dwayne and Travis through the same tests they had administered to Peggy. The results were the same: negative, inconclusive, or normal. But then, a neurologist overseeing Peggy's care noticed something that triggered a memory from his medical training. He suddenly realized what was happening. He informed his colleagues, and they quickly retrieved a specialized testing kit used for a rare and specific condition. They tested Peggy, Dwayne, and Travis, and the next day, the results confirmed the neurologist's suspicion. Unfortunately, while there was a cure for the condition, it was too late for Peggy. Her body had been so severely damaged that even the treatment wouldn't work fast enough to save her life. The doctors had to deliver the devastating news to Peggy, who, despite being heavily medicated, was still in unimaginable pain. They told her she was going to die and that their focus would now be on making her as comfortable as possible while trying to save her boys. Soon after receiving this tragic news, Peggy slipped into a coma. 4 months later, on March 3, 1989, her family made the heartbreaking decision to remove her from life support, and she passed away. Dwayne spent 2 months in the hospital, but eventually made a full recovery. Travis, however, was hospitalized for 6 months and, though he recovered, would never walk normally again. Even though the medical condition that caused Peggy's death and nearly took the lives of Dwayne and Travis was identified, the bigger question remained unanswered. Why did this happen? What caused this tragedy to unfold in their lives? The mystery lingered, leaving everyone baffled and searching for answers. However, shortly after Peggy's death, the mystery surrounding her condition began to unravel in the most unexpected and roundabout way. There exists an international organization called Mensa, not an acronym, but a Latin word meaning table or mind. Mensa is a highly exclusive society for the ultra-intelligent. To become a member, you must prove that your IQ, measured by an intelligence test, ranks in the top 2% worldwide. Even then, you might not make the hurt myself. In the same town where Peggy and Pi lived, Alturas, Florida, there was a Mensa chapter. Members of this chapter would gather monthly to engage in intellectually stimulating activities. In Alturas, one such activity was a Unalive Mystery Weekend. During these weekends, members would retreat to a private location, such as an inn or a cabin, and role-play a unalive investigation. one or two members would design a complex unalive scenario and assign different fictional characters to the real Mensa members. Upon arrival, everyone would receive their character roles and responsibilities, including details about the unalive to be solved. Once in character, complete with costumes, they would remain in character until the life taker was identified. These weekends were meant to be intellectually challenging, but also incredibly fun. The group loved their unalive mystery weekends. So, just a couple of weeks after Peggy passed away in April 1989, a new member was accepted into the Altura's Mensa chapter. Her name was Sherry Gwynn, a middle-aged woman who had recently fled Texas to escape her abusive husband, who still lived there. After being accepted into the Mensa chapter, it quickly became clear that Sherry was eager to make friends, particularly with two specific members: Diana Carr, who was unrelated to Pi Carr and his family, and Diana's husband, George Tropel. Diana was a successful orthopedic surgeon with her own practice in Alturas, while George was a computer programmer with an impressive array of advanced degrees. Importantly, Diana and George lived right next door to Peggy and Pi's house. Sherry came on strong in her attempts to befriend Diana and George, but the couple wasn't put off. They figured Sherry was just a lonely woman who had moved to a new area after leaving a difficult situation. Understanding her need for companionship, they were happy to befriend her. That same month, George and Diana were chosen to create the scenario for the upcoming Unalive Mystery Weekend. They diligently worked together, with George focusing on designing an incredibly elaborate, unalive scene that would be nearly impossible to solve. He was determined to craft the perfect crime. Once they were satisfied with their work, they printed out the cards with character assignments and details about the unalive and packed up their costumes for the weekend. When the weekend arrived, the Mensa members, including Sherry, gathered at the inn. George and Diana handed out the cards, and everyone read through the details of their characters and the unalive. George was particularly proud of the complex unalive scenario he had devised and even boasted about how challenging it would be to solve. As everyone read their roles, Sherry became fascinated with the unalive weapon used in the game. She went over to George and bombarded him with questions about how he had chosen that particular weapon and what it would do to a person, not just in the game, but in real life. Sherry's intense interest in the unalive method caught George's attention, but he found it flattering. After all, he had spent a lot of time crafting the perfect crime, so he indulged Sherry by explaining the weapon's effects on the human body, how to obtain it, and its history. Sherry was completely engrossed in the details. The Unalive Mystery Weekend was a success, and the Mensa members enjoyed themselves before heading home. But over the next year, Sherry became a near-constant presence in George and Diana's lives. She frequently called them, asked to meet up, and whenever she was with them, seemed particularly focused on George. She often brought up the unalive method George had devised, and he continued to indulge her, basking in the admiration. If George and Diana saw any red flags in Sherry's behaviour, they didn't show it. They seemed to believe that Sherry was simply a lonely, harmless woman who wanted to be their friend. But as they would soon learn, they were gravely mistaken. In December 1989, about 8 months after George and Diana first met Sherry, Diana decided to move her medical practice from Alturas to the neighbouring town of Sebring. The commute from their house in Alturas to the new office in Sebring was long enough that George and Diana decided to relocate to Sebring. When Sherry learned of their move, she immediately called George, asking to rent their house. She explained that she didn't have a place to stay and would pay whatever rent they asked. Since George and Diana had already discussed renting out their house, it was an easy decision. They trusted Sherry and agreed to let her rent the house for a couple of months, with the option to extend the arrangement if it worked out. Sherry arrived at Diana and George's doorstep with nothing more than a sleeping bag and a small bag of toiletries, ready to move in. George and Diana, after gathering the last of their belongings, handed Sherry the house key and said, "If you need anything, just give us a call." With that, They climbed into their car and drove off. As soon as they were out of sight, Sherry dropped her things, glanced around, and then quickly rushed into the house. Moments later, nearly the entire Alturas Police Department stormed through the front door after her. Within an hour, they would uncover something that not only exposed Sherry's true identity and intentions, but also revealed the chilling truth about what had happened to Peggy and her family. A few days before Peggy first started feeling unwell, when her heart began racing and her arms and legs tingled at the diner, someone had placed 8 glass bottles of Coca-Cola in the kitchen of Peggy and Pi's home. These bottles were tucked away in a storage nook, almost out of sight. When the family discovered them a few days later, they didn't think much of it, assuming that someone in the family had bought them. They became fair game, and soon enough, Peggy and her family were drinking the sodas. Peggy, who was known for her love of Coca-Cola, consumed more than anyone else. What they didn't know was that all 8 of those Coca-Cola bottles had been tampered with. Each contained a lethal dose of a heavy metal called thallium. Thallium is odorless, colorless, and tasteless, making it incredibly difficult to detect. While small amounts naturally occur in the body, any significant increase can be deadly. By the time Peggy was admitted to the hospital for the second time, along with Dwayne and Travis, a neurologist noticed that her hair was starting to fall out, a key symptom of thallium poisoning. He remembered his medical training about thallium and ordered tests for the 3 of them. The results confirmed that they had been poisoned with astronomical levels of thallium. Dwayne and Travis had 20,000 times the normal amount of thallium in their bodies, and Peggy had an astounding 50,000 times the lethal dose. The doctors realized early on that the family had been poisoned and contacted the police, who launched an investigation. Initially, their primary suspect was Pi. He and Peggy had been arguing frequently before she fell ill, and his abrupt hunting trip on the day she first felt unwell raised suspicions. Additionally, Pi worked at a phosphate mining company, which gave him access to rare chemicals. However, upon further investigation, the police determined that Pi did not have access to thallium, which is extremely rare and expensive. The idea that he would use such a rare substance to poison his wife and then poison himself and his son made little sense. As a result, Pi was quickly ruled out as a suspect. During one of his final interrogations, Pi mentioned something he didn't consider important, but turned out to be crucial. He revealed that 3 months before Peggy got sick, the family had received a death threat. One day, Pi found a typed note in the mail that read, "Your family needs to leave Florida in the next 2 weeks, or you're all gonna die." Pi thought it was a childish prank and didn't take it seriously. When 2 weeks passed and nothing happened, he forgot about it. With Pi ruled out, the police had no other leads. They focused on identifying the author of the threatening note, which led them to Sherry Gwynn. But Sherry Gwynn wasn't who she claimed to be. Her real name was Susan Gallick, and she had lived in Central Florida for most of her life. Susan was intelligent, but not the genius she pretended to be, and it's likely that she forged her way into the Alturas Mensa chapter. Susan had no real interest in befriending Diana and George. Instead, she was an undercover police officer sent in after the authorities discovered that Diana and George were behind the death threat sent to Peggy and Pi. It turned out that Diana and George despised Peggy, Pi, and their children, finding them obnoxious and too noisy. Diana, a strict and overbearing person who insisted on being addressed as Dr. Carr, had gotten into heated arguments with Peggy and Pi when she went over to their house to demand they turn down their music and be quieter. Peggy and Pi, unwilling to tolerate her demands, had dismissed her. George, on the other hand, was more reclusive and meek, rarely engaging in public confrontations. Instead, he spent his days obsessively watching the family through the window, growing increasingly irritated by their behavior. As Diana's frustration mounted, George decided to take drastic action. He typed out the threatening note and sent it across to Peggy and Pi's home. When they didn't leave Florida within the 2-week deadline, George moved to phase 2 of his plan. George had spent time in federal prison in the 1970s for cooking methamphetamine, during which he learned how to produce thallium as a byproduct. Using his old methamphetamine cooking skills, George created lethal doses of thallium and carefully added them to 8 Coca-Cola bottles. After ensuring the poison was undetectable, he used his homebrew equipment to reseal the bottles. George had a bottle capping machine because he made his own beer at home. Once the deadly drinks were prepared, George waited for a moment when Peggy and Pi's family was out, then snuck into their kitchen and placed the bottles in a storage nook before leaving. Over the next few weeks, George watched with twisted satisfaction as the family fell ill and Peggy eventually died. Although George never explicitly admitted to poisoning his neighbours, he exhibited behaviours that strongly suggested his guilt. For instance, during the Mensa Unalive Mystery Weekend, the unalive method George had devised involved poisoning, an eerie parallel to what had happened to Peggy and her family. At that point, Susan, who was undercover, was tasked with uncovering whether George and Diana were responsible for poisoning their neighbours. Her interactions with George, particularly his detailed explanations of poisoning, only deepened her suspicions. Susan, who had successfully earned George's trust by being submissive and flattering his ego, eventually secured an invitation to rent George and Diana's home when they planned to move. George, accustomed to Diana's domineering personality, enjoyed the sense of control he felt around Susan and completely trusted her, even allowing her to move into their home while many of their belongings were still inside. As soon as George and Diana drove off, Susan called in backup. The police swarmed the house, searching it from top to bottom. In the garage, they made a discovery that would finally bring the truth to light. In the garage, the police discovered George's chemistry equipment, and nestled beneath it was a bottle containing thallium. This crucial piece of evidence would seal George's fate. He was found guilty of first-degree unalive for Peggy's death and attempted unalive of the rest of her family. George was sentenced to death, and as of this episode, he remains on death row. Many people suspected that George's wife Diana must have been involved in the poisoning or, at the very least, aware of it. However, no charges were ever brought against her. Diana eventually divorced George, moved on with her life, and remarried. And that concludes the harrowing story of Peggy Carr, whose tragic fate was sealed by a neighbour's twisted plot. The shocking discovery of the truth behind her suffering serves as a chilling reminder that evil can sometimes lurk where we least expect it. If this story left you captivated, be sure to give it a thumbs up, share it with others, and hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into true crime mysteries. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and we'll see you in the next video.